Man Up, a program dedicated to inspiring and helping men live lives of heroic virtue. And now, it's time to Man Up.
Welcome to Man Up on Iowa Catholic Radio. We are broadcasting on the Iowa Catholic Radio Network. I am Joe Stopulos. This is Man Up. And today we are going to be discussing books. How about that for a title? Books. Wanted to reflect on the books I read that I learned from and that I grew from in 2021. So we'll dive through a lot of those and hopefully spark some interest in you, or maybe introduce you to an author or a book or two that can maybe help change your life this year in 2022. Let's start in prayer. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. Saint Michael the Archangel, defend us in battle, be our protection against the wickedness and the snares of the devil. May God rebuke him, we humbly pray, and do thou, O Prince of the heavenly host, by the power of God, thrust into hell Satan and all the evil spirits who prowl about the world, seeking the ruin of souls. Amen. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen. I can think of no title for a show that is less exciting than books. But that's the title of the show, is books. And hopefully you'll stick with me and you'll glean something from it. Again, I really enjoy reading now. It's something I didn't. I think my wife changed me significantly on this. Some nudges from friends, nudges from my brothers, nudges from my wife, and all of a sudden I'm just loving it, absolutely loving it. And there were so many great books that were recommended to me, given to me that I explored this year. And again, I'm playing catch up a lot. I'm just absolutely playing catch up because of how far I waited to get into this. And so now I'm sprinting to catch up, but there were so many great authors, great titles that I read this year in a myriad of different subjects that I thought it would merit taking time today to sit back. I was reflecting on them anyway, so sit back and reflect. And when I read a book, I don't just read it and put it down. I try to absorb it. I try to go back, listen to talks on it, maybe even write notes on it, so that way I can glean whatever the insights are from that book when I return to it. So in today's episode, on the other side of the break, we will discuss, or I will just kind of pontificate, quite honestly, on the books that I read in 2021 and what I learned from them, and hopefully you can glean something out of these great titles. Stick around. We're going to head to a short break, and we'll be right back.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio provided by Bell Construction. Bell Construction is a roofing company. They specialize in residential re-roofs, light commercial jobs, and have the experience to meet all of your roofing needs with personal service. With Bell Construction, the owner will come to your home or place of business in person to inspect and ensure the quality of work that you deserve. They pride themselves in working with you on a personal basis and making sure you are satisfied. Bell Construction, 515-963-4494. Bell Construction.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio provided by the Society of St. Vincent de Paul. Established in Des Moines in 1924, St. Vincent de Paul assists those living in poverty to become self-sufficient by helping to remove roadblocks on their journey out of poverty. St. Vincent de Paul helps with food, clothing, and shelter, while also offering classes in financial literacy, high school completion, career readiness, and prisoner reentry. Shop, donate, volunteer, serve. The Society of St. Vincent de Paul, svdpdsm.org.
My help comes from you. You're right here.
Welcome back to Man Up on Iowa Catholic Radio. I am Joe Stopulos, and today I am going to be discussing books I read in 2021. Not a very exciting title, I understand that, but I do my reflections right at the end of the year and beginning of the year per se, and I look back on how last year went and what I project forward for this year. And if you followed the show for any amount of time, you know that I basically never read any books ever until like my mid-20s, late 20s. Even in high school and college, I would do anything I could to avoid reading the book. I would spark note things. I would guess on tests. I was very good at avoiding books and playing video games for a long time. That said, around my late 20s, somewhere in there, and I read some business books, obviously, in my young 20s that I needed to, but I got into literature great literature probably in my late 20s. And so then, since then, it went from, reading 6 books one year to 12 books the next year to 20 books the next year to 30 books the next year, whatever it was. And it's now become a major part of my life, And I have, this past year, discovered audiobooks. So for Lent in 2020, I said no podcasts. So I love podcasts. I listen to a ton of podcasts. Sorry, I should say, let me caveat that. No non-religious podcasts. So if I was learning something and it was in the religious sphere, I would allow it. But otherwise, no religious podcasts. And so with that, I said, but audiobooks are fair game. Obviously, if it's got to be a wholesome audiobook, something good, either a great work of literature or something in business or politics or religion or something like that. That was something that was worth learning. So with that, this year, my book number or whatever exploded just because I had the ability to get way more done. I cut out so many kind of like entertainment, quote unquote, podcasts and turned it to audiobooks. And so, I've gotten a lot of questions from people on, hey, I got a lot of book recommendation questions. And then also in addition to that, like what do you use? What services do you use for audiobooks and things like that? So it's been so beneficial to me that I thought I would at least share with you some of the titles that really I thought were extraordinary this year that I thought were worth recommending. Talk through those quickly as I just reflect on the last year. Also, just as a heads up, I am too cheap to pay for Audible. If you can subscribe to Audible, that's probably the best way to do it. I don't know how much it costs, like $10 to $15 a month, so it's not an inexpensive amount, but it's definitely something to think about if that's of interest to you. I personally am a fan of the library, and the library has a few apps you can use: Hoopla, Overdrive, Libby. Those are a few to name a few. And there's also LibriVox, which does a good job of giving you a lot of the classics on LibriVox. So Hoopla, Overdrive, Libby, and LibriVox are the ones that I tend to use. So with that in mind, as we move into this year, so I basically now am reading books at night, in the morning, whenever I can, physically, and then throughout the day, especially if it's a book that is like a novel type. If it's reading like a novel, it's much easier to listen to on Audible. So I'm going to break it down. Again, I do this because I have so many people that ask me about book recommendations and things that I've enjoyed learning about or reading about, and I'm happy to share them. And I thought, as I was reflecting back this past year on a lot of the books I read, man, there's a lot that I'd like to recommend to people, and a lot of life lessons we can glean from them. So in the sphere of literature, I tackled Dickens pretty heavily to start the year, which was great. I loved it all. Bleak House was probably the largest feat I did on that, and it was worth reading. It was worth the slog, I thought, because it's a lot. It's like 900 pages of Dickens, but Bleak House was a masterpiece. Moby Dick. I got to talk about Moby Dick because I mentioned it in an episode earlier this year. Moby Dick is very difficult to get through, I thought, because of the amount of whale facts. Just so many whale facts that you have to get through. The ending is great. There is a lot of, I believe, tremendous morals that can be taught from Moby Dick. I think there's a lot to be gleaned from it. That said, I could see why people would stop reading it because he just goes on these tangents. I mean, it's 1850, so he's going to have some tangents on whale facts just to give people hadn't ever seen a whale before, most likely, and so it gets a little bit too detailed for me on the whale facts. So we'll move on from the literature pieces. Those are probably less important. I had a few other ones that I thought were worthwhile, but probably not on the recommendation side. Okay, so I kind of broke the next sections down into history, like sales, business, self-help, religion and philosophy, and then politics and economics, all of these being probably more applicable to what we're going to talk about. So in history, all right, book recommendations. So Rocket Men was a book by Robert Kurson that was about the Apollo 8 mission. Super interesting stuff. Apollo 8, yeah. Really interesting stuff there. I love everything on exploration. And so that was a great one because Apollo 8 is kind of a forgotten mission, but it was super important in how we got to even get to 9, 10, and then obviously 11 that got us there. That was a given to me by a friend, Mr. Tim Flattery. So thanks, Tim, for the Rocket Man book. That was a great one to start the year with. All right, huge David McCullough fan. If you've not read David McCullough, probably my highest recommendation from history to get into history is David McCullough. He is, when history meets storytelling, he can tell all the facts, all the figures, and tie it up into this unbelievable story that is true. So if you know of the series on HBO from like 2008 or so, 2006, something like that, on John Adams, that was based on his book, John Adams. I would start with the book 1776 about the American founding. It was one of the most, so similar to how I've mentioned in the past how Jeff Cavins' Bible study, to me, was this linchpin kind of changing of the way I read the Bible. I would say 1776 was kind of, and it's a short book, it's like 350 pages, was kind of a linchpin changing of the way I view the founding of the country, specifically the role that George Washington played. So 1776, amazing. Well, this year I kind of got on, because of audiobooks, you can listen to McCullough so quickly and learn so much. There's his book Truman, which is like 1,200 pages. It's a big one, but my respect for Harry Truman is off the charts. I knew very little about Harry Truman previously. This book is kind of considered one of his best. He won a bunch of awards for Truman. A spectacular book. And you know what? We live in Iowa. Truman was just down south of us, a few hours in Missouri. So, it might be nice for you to know a little bit more about Harry Truman. That way, when you're driving to Kansas City, you can talk about Harry Truman when you're seeing his name on the signs. Other McCullough books this year, The Wright Brothers. Again, I know about the Wright brothers tangentially, but now I know about them fairly intimately, and just a phenomenal story that I feel like you want to shout it from the rooftops when you hear about these things. The Wright Brothers by David McCullough, a phenomenal book. Again, very quick read, 300 pages maybe. You can get through it in no time flat. And my love and respect and reverence for the Wright brothers and what they accomplished is off the charts, and it was something I did not understand prior to that. But again, McCullough writes in a way that you can understand it. And then lastly, I ended up reading his John Adams book, which just further details the life of John Adams. And again, that's probably 800 or 900 pages book. But it gives you this view of what his life was like in such intimate detail. It's such a wonderful, just such a phenomenal life to know about as one of the kind of 3-4 key players in the founding of the country. The Masters of the Air, this was given to me by a good friend, Chris Ingstead, knowing that my grandfather was a pilot in World War II, and this book kind of chronicles the bombers, all the bombing units of World War II, and kind of how that program came to be. And man, again, gave me a way more respect for what my grandfather and all those people did in the dangers they went. It was like a 30% chance of survival, essentially, to get all your missions done. To fly 30 missions, and at the beginning, it had basically never been done. People were dying left and right, and they got better at it. But still, man, the death rate was so high throughout, and it just documents all the things they went through. Actually, interesting thing, if you've seen Band of Brothers, this will be Masters of the Air. I believe Apple has bought the rights to it, and they're going to make, along with, I think, Steven Spielberg and Tom Hanks, the next iteration of the Band of Brothers, and they're going to use Masters of the Air as the starting point for that. That's based on Master of the Air. So very interesting. Obviously, timing-wise, that's pretty exciting. So if you're into World War II history at all, if you have anyone you know that served in any capacity in the bomber units in World War II, this book is a must-read. It gives you so much more respect for what they went through. Endurance by Alfred Lansing. This is a recommendation by my good friend Justin Doyle, and I have now, again, recommended this to many people. This chronicles Ernest Shackleton and his journey to the South Pole, and it is one of the most incredible stories I've ever read in my entire life. Absolutely the most incredible. You can't describe it, what they went through. And so I'm here in a cold Iowa winter, and I reflect often when I'm freezing cold about how whatever I'm doing just pales in comparison to what these guys went through on this trip to the South Pole. An incredible, and then all the ending. The ending is, it's actually unbelievable, and it's one of the coolest stories of exploration of all time, and mostly it's a cool story of survival of all time. And then this guy Alfred Lansing, as far as writing the book, there's 1950s, and it is so well done. It reads like a well-written piece of literature, and it happens to be a true piece of history. So, Endurance. Also, one thing I'd point out with Endurance is in anything in history that there's a great podcast I listen to called Explorers Podcast, and I love the Explorers Podcast, and he does an 9-part series on Ernest Shackleton, and a lot of it's based in this book. So if you want to get a taste of it through that, you can. But I would recommend anything that guy does in that podcast. And Ordinary Men. Ordinary Men was a book I read last year. Fascinating book on the Holocaust. And I read this during Exodus 90 last year. I try to read something that's a little bit, sets the stage on suffering, I suppose. And this just talked about how these men who were working in the SS, or not, these are just the guys who were off the street. Sorry, not the SS. These are the guys who were just off the street that were working in the concentration camps, doing the actual killing. How they were, basically brought from nothing. There's normal dudes, and then they just kind of started slowly making them murder people. And at first they were horrified, but then eventually they got callous to it, and then eventually they were slaughtering tons of people. Very interesting take historically on how, as Anders Alexander Solzhenitsyn pointed, that the thread between good and evil, the line between good and evil runs through every human heart, and how these people have this choice, and they just got calloused, and they got basically brainwashed into this. And it's a fascinating story about how guys that you probably went to high school with, or yourself, could end up being one of these people. So just a absolutely fascinating story, and kind of a must read when you're learning about the Holocaust. It was very eye opening to me. And then kind of the sales, health, or self help area. One that stuck out to me that I thought would be worth reading. It's called Can't Hurt Me. Actually, I was at my men's group recently, and some guy had the book and was reading it. Can't Hurt Me is by David Goggins. David Goggins is a ultra marathoner, Navy SEAL, really bad dude. Just tough guy. And this book, I would not read it as as marital advice. I would not read it as fatherhood advice. I would not read it as advice on how to live as a decent human being. But I would read it as you can do more than what you think you can do. This guy, what he did, his ability to just mentally change gears and ramp it up to. I thought about doing a full episode on it, and I still might come back to it someday, because I think there's a lot of good takeaways there on how to get past pain, how to get past suffering, how to get past hurdles to achieve your goals. Again, I think he does it at the expense of a lot of other things, and I think he's built in a different way than most people. That said, if we can just glean a little bit from what he did, it could be a game changer for so many people because of his discipline. The guy was like 300 pounds overweight and said, I'm going to be a Navy SEAL. And then within like 6 months, he had lost all the weight, done all the training, and was on his way to becoming a Navy SEAL. It's an incredible story of perseverance and of mental fortitude. But again, very R-rated, to say the least. A lot of profanity. There's actually a clean version of the book. You can buy a clean version of the book, or you can buy the original version. I can't imagine that the original version adds much, except for just a lot of curse words. But again, that is Can't Hurt Me by David Goggins. Moving on to the religion and philosophy area. Few things I want to point here. I've talked about a bunch of them. So I've talked about Joseph and His World by Mike Aquilina. I talked about The Fulfillment of All Desire by Dr. Ralph Martin. I talked about From Christendom to Apostolic Mission by Monsignor Shea, which is probably my most recommended book of the year. That one has been spectacular. I just loved it. I did get into Orthodoxy by Chesterton. I read that this year. I'm still not smart enough to fully understand Chesterton when I read it. I just can't do it. But I loved it. I actually enjoyed it. I went back. I read slowly, and I'll probably revisit it again. One that I did want to point out was called Father Elijah by O'Brien. And I'm trying to think of O'Brien's first name. I'm not going to turn around and find it in my library, but it is awesome. Father Elijah was a page turner. I loved it. I say it's in religion and philosophy. I only say that because the premise of the book is about a priest. It's about a guy. It's about the Pope. It's got a lot of religious connotations to it. But, man, it was about as thrilling a novel as you could read. It was spectacular. So if you're looking for a good page-turner that happens to be in the realm of the Catholic sphere, Father Elijah was spectacular. I also, the Abolition of Man from C.S. Lewis, really good take on relativism, really good take on how there are truths in the world, and it refutes a lot of the ideas of the secular culture that anyone's opinion is valid as any other, and that there's no true goods in the world. And C.S. Lewis does a great job of explaining that away. And then lastly, the Case for Christ by Lee Strobel. This book had become so highly recommended to me, and I'm not going to not recommend it. I thought it was really well done. I did think it was really well done. I think I'd heard, maybe because it's like 20 years later, I'd heard a lot of the arguments on this book. There were some new ones to me for sure. That said, I'd heard a lot of the arguments probably because he laid them out so succinctly. But The Case of Christ, Lee Strobel was an investigative journalist and lawyer, I believe, who tried to basically prove that Christ didn't exist, and in doing that, prove that he did exist when he was kind of going through the case of Christ. Lastly, a few other things I want to mention, kind of politics, economics. There were some good ones I hit this year that I thought would be worth sharing. I mentioned a little bit in my interview with Tim Carney on his book, Alienated America, about hillbilly elegy. Both of those were great reads. I thought, obviously, you can get a taste for Alienated America on my podcast with Tim Carney if you want to get an idea of what that what that felt like. I did read Atlas Shrugged this year. And again, this is where audiobook helped a lot because I could kind of back and forth between the audiobook and the real book. And I think Atlas Shrugged has to be the book that is on the most bookshelves but isn't read. And the amount of people I know who own this book, I see it at their house, and I'm like, hey, Atlas Shrugged. He goes, yep. I'm like, what'd you think? He goes, haven't read it yet. I've heard it from 1,000 people. And I was one of those people. This was kind of the year where I'm like, I'm going to read all the books on my bookshelf. I'm going to try to start getting through them. Atlas Shrugged was one of those. I loved it. I know a lot of people don't love it. Obviously, this is a Catholic radio show. This is obviously the Christian message supposed to be coming out of here. Similar to David Goggins, there are things you have to take with a grain of salt with this book, Atlas Shrugged. I believe a lot of the stuff that she preaches, a lot of the things that she talks about the importance of achievement, the importance of human striving for greatness. I mean, again, a lot of parallels there with the Goggins thing, and how we need to reward that, and how we need to, people need to strive for the best and the greatest that they can be. I thought Ayn Rand did a really great job of showing that in this book. And the just taking for granted greatness, for how we need to as a society try to help people like the Wright brothers, like all these other people, and reward them for their greatness. At the same time, you can't use this as a model for your life because you're, again, similar to Goggins, your marriages would be in shambles, your relationships with other people will be in shambles. So do not read this book as a marital guide or as a guide to friendships. But I thought it was a fast read considering the size of it. And again, when you're doing it on audiobook, it reads I thought it read really well, really fast. The last couple I want to talk about are from Thomas Sowell. So Thomas Sowell is a man I've read many articles on that he's written. Thomas Sowell is probably in his mid-90s now. He's an economist that he was very prominent in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and then even into the 90s. He was a black economist who grew up, I believe, in Harlem, was an avowed socialist early on in his career, and then ended up becoming kind of I don't know if you call it a capitalist, a Chicago school economist later on in life. And Thomas Sowell, to me, is now like my favorite author and writer and thinker in this sphere of politics and economics. So anything you can read by Thomas Sowell comes with my seal of approval. It's probably the greatest. I mean, he is so well thought out. And the two that I read this year were the Thomas Sowell Reader, which is kind of a collection of a lot of different topics that he has. So if you're looking for an introduction into Thomas Sowell, this book is it. I mean, it covers a lot of different things from a lot of his writings from across the years, and it is spectacular. And then similar to how Truman is kind of the biggest and best book, I would say. Well, I don't think it's necessarily the best, but it's up there. It's got the most awards for it. His book called Basic Economics, it's Thomas Sowell's Basic Economics. I think it's in its 5th edition now, is spectacular. It is absolutely phenomenal. It gives, without tons of complicated charts and graphs and concepts, he just speaks, it's all written out, and he just speaks to how economics works, 101. And he does it through lots of examples, and it's probably 600 or 700 pages. It's a decent-sized book, and it is awesome. So anything you can read by Thomas Sowell, but those first two that I mentioned, the Reader and Basic Economics, would give you a great foray into that. So I will wrap this up. I'm running long. I'll wrap this up on the other side of the break, but I wanted to share with you some thoughts on some recommendations from the past year. So stick around. We'll head to a break, and we'll be right back.
This is a Young Catholic Minute.
If someone's really suffering, why can't we just put them out of their misery?
Because every life is sacred. When did we get the idea that we have a right to die? Not from our nature for self-preservation, not from our Constitution's right to life, not from God who has come that we might have life. So why would anyone choose death? We know that God has made us for fullness of life, and when we suffer, it feels like that gets in the way. So it makes sense that we'd want to get rid of our suffering to return to that fullness of life. What euthanasia does instead is get rid of life to end suffering. But the whole point of ending suffering was so that we could have life. Still, knowing this doesn't necessarily make our suffering easier, but God lets us offer it for the good of others, just as Christ did. As you offer your suffering back to Christ, He hears your deep prayer of resignation to His will. And there is huge miracle potential in that, whether for you or somebody else. So as hard as it may be in practice, your grandmother was right. Offer it up. For more Young Catholic Minutes, youngcatholicminute.com.
My help comes from you. You're right.
Welcome back to Man Up on Iowa Catholic Radio. I ran a little long on that middle segment there. Obviously, a lot to cover. Again, the audiobook thing helped. There's no question that the audiobook thing helped. I was able to cover a lot of those in a short amount of time on car rides and on jogs and working out and stuff. So I listened to Atlas Shrugged while working out. Listen, that's just the way it goes. That's how you get to read a lot, is you do it whenever you can. So I continue to dwell on the fact that I didn't read books for so long, and now it has become an integral part of who I am. And I know I'm better for it. I know that I've become a much better person because of it. I know that I have my views are much more well formed. I've changed some views, and it just helps you to connect better with other people when you have this baseline understanding of literature, of politics, of economics, all these types of things. So my encouragement, hopefully, this year for you is to hopefully get the bug as well. If you're not already having the reading bug, hopefully some of this can give you some ideas of some of the authors. Again, the McCulloughs, the Sowells. I mentioned some of these ones where you can't really go wrong if you read into their stuff. And again, I discovered audiobooks. It kind of changed my trajectory on reading. And so maybe get into that. Again, I mentioned Hoopla, Overdrive, Audible, all great options. So hopefully this year, 2022, we can all continue to grow in our education, in our wisdom, and our knowledge through great books. Thanks for joining me today on Man Up. I am Joe Stopulos. It's time to Man Up.
Man Up, inspiring men to live out their call to holiness.